Helen Fillmore is a member of the Washoe tribe of Nevada and California. She currently works for her tribe as an environmental specialist, and she is here today to share with you some of her knowledge on traditional ecological knowledge. So take it away, Helen.
And hello everyone, can you hear me okay? Okay, and then can you guys see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So meongo mivi dewat le umet degum dia lei paulu de dei lei Washoe lei. My name's Helen Fillmore. I'm part of the Washoe tribe. My educational background is in environmental science and terrestrial resource management and in hydrology as well, which is the study of water. The title of my presentation today is Traditional Knowledge in STEM Fields, Lessons from Washoe, so lessons from my homelands. When I was a kid, I attended, our tribe had a language immersion school, Washoe. It was called Washoe Wagayai Mangal. And at this school, we were taught everything in Washoe language. It didn't have your traditional, I guess, or I shouldn't say traditional, but your normal Western education-based subjects. So we didn't have English, math, science, in kind of the way that you normally think about school. Our science classes instead were primarily taught outdoors in the language from both our elders and our teachers, as well as from local and regional environmental scientists. This is a picture of all of us students with Dr. Goldman, who's one of the kind of premier limnologists or scientists who study lakes in the Tahoe Basin. This is a quick map of Washoe, so Washoe homelands. And in the center of our homelands is Da'au Aga, which is now more commonly known as Lake Tahoe. We're kind of split in half between Nevada and California. And, you know, the western half of our homelands are more in the Sierra Nevadas, where you have timber forests and different kinds of high mountain ecosystems. And on the eastern half, we have its high desert ecosystem, where we have more Pinyon-Juniper, sagebrush environment. And both of those areas were kind of equally important to our communities and to our people and our lifeways. The darker green is kind of what I refer to as disputed Washoe territory, so that area was kind of the overlapping areas and trading areas with some of the surrounding tribes within the region. Within, I guess, our own history, we think about colonization as, you know, colonization really started happening in our territories in the 1850s on a much larger scale than it was previously. We were located in an area that was kind of hard to get to, so we didn't really start getting settlement like most settled early by the Spanish, and then I guess like outside of Nevada it was a lot earlier, but we started getting the larger impacts of colonization during the gold rush, and specifically within our homelands when the Comstock lode was found in Virginia City, and this was the silver, huge amounts of silver were found right directly within our homelands. And what that led to was, unfortunately, a lot of degradation. It led to the deforestation, almost complete deforestation of the Tahoe Basin, you know, the most sacred place to our people. And then also the deforestation of our Pinyon-Juniper trees, which were important for our sustenance and for our communities there, as well as the contamination from the mining of our waterways. And as I mentioned before, we're in a high desert, so we don't really have a lot of water outside of the Tahoe Basin. So with this degradation was kind of a lot of landscape change, a lot of historical uses that have damaged our homelands. The other kind of big land use change or landscape change was when the Stewart Indian Boarding School was opened in 1890. In some ways, having the school within our homelands helped our families stay a little bit more connected to our homelands than some of the other students who were being taken, away from their homes all across the United States. A lot of our families were able to kind of stay together a little bit better just because of where it was located. But at the same time, this was when most of our families started adopting more Western traditions and started adopting, normal, what we would consider normal professions, when they stopped speaking our language as often. And so these two big changes were when a lot of our own our Washoe ways started changing on a much larger scale. Before that, we were pretty much living kind of as traditionally as our ancestors to a large degree. But those were those big changes. So roughly 15,000 years, and I'll tell you why I use 15,000 years of Indigenous land use and roughly 150 years of colonization. And so as environmental scientists, a lot of what we're addressing is a really recent history of degradation, but a long history of Indigenous land use and carrying on traditional practices of our ancestors. And so I put this slide in here because this is a concept that I'm gonna come back to frequently. And this is this idea that restoring our people to our landscape will also restore the health of our ecosystems. And so in Washoe Way, when I introduced myself, I said Paualuta Ilai, which means the area east of Tahoe, the land I am. And this is an idea where Washoe Way, we don't see ourselves as being separate from our homelands. We don't see our personal identity as being outside of our homelands. We see it as an integral part of who we are. And so the health of our homelands is inextricably linked to the health of ourselves, our own spiritual and physical well-being. And so this idea that if we can restore this relationship, we can restore both our own personal and community health, but also the health of our homelands, is something that really drives a lot of the work that I do, and a lot of kind of the perspective that I come from when I'm doing this work. So to give a quick little definition, traditional ecological knowledges is kind of the term we use now to describe Washoe Way. What I would call our Washoe traditional practices, our Washoe Way, is now kind of in academia or in the sciences, in our educations, we call this traditional knowledges. And this is a place-based perspective, so it comes from within our homelands. Washoe traditional knowledge isn't necessarily transferable outside of our homelands. It's the accumulation of experiences over thousands of years on how the use of the land and how to use the land and its resources sustainably. It's also a holistic worldview, and so we don't separate disciplines. We don't separate STEM into the disciplines. We kind of think of them as all being interconnected. And then I leave this last phrase in here because traditional knowledge is science. Whereas science, we collect data, we have theories, we use the data to try to answer questions. Traditional knowledge is the same way, but it's the accumulation of experiences is almost like the accumulation of data over a much longer time period than we have now within the science. Also, at the same time, traditional knowledge can both inform science. And then in my work, I also try to see how science can help inform or help us revitalize some of our traditional practices, which isn't always going to be, I guess, it's not, that idea is not always appropriate, kind of depending on what we're talking about or what we're doing. But in some instances, it really can be, especially when we're in revitalizing our traditional practices, in revitalizing our traditional land uses. A lot of that information, a lot of those stories, a lot of those teachings have been lost. And again, due to huge landscape changes, but then also due to colonization and our relationship with our history with boarding schools and history of trying to kind of fight this ongoing, I guess, ongoing loss. So with that, in reconstructing traditional knowledges, I kind of break it up into a lot of different practices. So when we say traditional knowledge, when people say that, it can mean so many different things. So I try to break it up into ideas that are a little bit more, I guess, digestible, or more, they're just smaller so that we can actually think about them and talk about them. And so traditional knowledge can be found in our oral histories, in our legends. It can be found in our land use practices, how we use the land, how we walked the land. It can be found in our hunting and gathering techniques. It can be found in how we prepare our food, what our people used to do to prepare food. It's in our languages, it's in our ceremonies, it's in our traditional games. Our traditional games, in some ways are pastimes, but in other ways it was a place of sharing with both, our own communities, our different families. It can also be found in our value systems, our worldviews, and our ethics. So a lot of times, I think a lot of Indigenous people, particularly in the United States, have different relationships with colonization and different relationships with loss. So we might not all know our oral histories, we might not all know our legends, we might not all know our language, or might only know a few words, but all of us through our families have been passed down these traditional value systems, these traditional ethics on how to use our land or how to treat each other, to work together, and these different worldviews. So even if other aspects of this, if we don't have them kind of innately within our teachings, that there's still, I guess, evidence of it, or vestiges of that traditional knowledge that can still be used to try to develop or to think about how we can live in this world sustainably. And then also within international and intertribal exchanges. And I put this in there as well because, since time immemorial, our communities have been trading with each other. We've been playing games against each other. We have words that we've shared across languages. And so even within that, sometimes we can learn from our neighboring communities about, how a plant was used, or how did they gather a certain resource? How did they use a certain resource? And we can talk about, how that may be similar or different to us for our ecosystem. But that's also a place of a place where we can start to reconstruct some of what this knowledge might look like, and how we can use it in our current, present land use practices, and in our current and present, I guess, personal lives. And so I'm going to go back between 7,000 and 15,000 years ago and share with you one of our legends. And this is a legend of how Tahoe was formed. And there's a bunch of, depending on who your family was and how this legend was passed down to you, there's a lot of different versions of it. But I'm going to share the version that was published in this book, Washoe Tales. And the reason why I'm sharing this is because this version is because it is a published version, so it's already publicly accessible. And this version was published in 1968. The story was originally told by, I believe it was Bill Fillmore, and then no relation, but he was Washoe, and then Henry Moses Rupert translated it for Grace Steinberg. She wasn't Washoe, but she was the one who ultimately wrote it down and got it published. And so in this story, we have two brothers. One is Weasel and the other one is Gray Squirrel, and it's Puetzali and Damalali. And in this version of the story, Damalali is the younger brother, Puetzali is the older brother. And it starts out, this part of the legend starts out that they had just kind of gotten back from a failed hunting expedition. And so they went hunting and they weren't able to get what they wanted. And Damalali, they come up here along the southern shore of Tahoe, and Puetzali goes off to go off by himself, and he goes and walks away. And Damalali is really kind of getting bummed within himself. He's a little disappointed because he wasn't able to show his brother, his big brother, what a great hunter he was, and he really did kind of let him down. And so Damalali is getting after himself, but then he looks out to the lake's edge, and out there on a rock sunbathing itself was a metsunge. And the metsunge are, I guess we call them water babies now, but those are a spiritual being in Washoe culture. And they're not something that's necessarily bad. They're not something that's necessarily good, but they're something that's really powerful. And in Washoe way, there's something that we don't mess with, or we don't try to go look for or anything like that, because they have a lot of power. Damalali, he's our trickster. Puetzali and Damalali are our tricksters. So Damalali is getting a little bit, plotting as soon as he sees that metsunge sunbathing himself, and he thinks to himself, I'm going to kill that metsunge, and I'm going to make my brother so proud and show him what a great hunter I am. So he sneaks up on it, and the metsunge says, stop, if you kill me, the lake will swallow you up. I'll have the lake and it'll swallow you up. And Damalali, of course, he doesn't listen. And so he goes and he starts attacking the metsunge, and they start rolling and wrestling around the entire shore of the lake. And as they're wrestling around the shore, they are calling out our place names. So that'll be Lamwata, and that'll be Atabi Shema, and that'll be Deek Wadapush. And as they're going around, they go around the entire edge of the lake until they get back to what's called Debelelik. And there, Damalali finally gets the best of that metsunge, and he kills him, and he takes its hair. And it had this long, beautiful hair, and he takes it and he starts thinking how proud his brother is going to be of him, and he starts running towards his brother over here toward the southeastern side of the lake, and his brother Puetzali is standing up on top of that mountain, and Damalali is running after him. And as he's getting up there and he starts waving the hair up to Puetzali, and he's, look what I got, brother, look what I got. And Puetzali's yelling at him, no, throw it back, the lake, it's coming to get you. And chasing Damalali up that lake, or up the mountain as he was running, it was a giant wave. And every time it would get pretty close, he'd throw a little strand of hair back, and it would die down just a little bit, but then it would come back, and he'd throw some more hair back. And finally, to prevent him and his brother from dying, he throws the rest of the hair back, and the lake subsides and goes back to normal. And in our way, this is the legend of both how the lake was formed, but then also how we got our place names, as well as how the little lakes that all are up in the mountains surrounding Tahoe were also formed during this event. And so this is an important story to us, because it's about, the most sacred place in our homelands, and it's about how it was formed. And so now I want to share a geology paper. This one was published in 2006, but it's based off a study that was originally published in 2001. And this study shows that sometime between 7,000 and 15,000 years ago, a earthquake dropped a bunch of sediment into the ground, and it was a single event. And so the earthquake created a landslide, and when that landslide hit, it created a tsunami that went up to the same side of the lake that was described in our legend. and then it subsided down. And so it was this huge tsunami. So this was a study that was published again in 2001 about an environmental event, about an event that happened between 7,000 and 15,000 years ago that our elders have been passing down for generations. And so in a lot of ways, science is just catching up with what Washoe people have already known and have already been doing for thousands of years. And this was something that at the Washoe school that we talked about, that we learned about. So this isn't a new idea to our community, but this is kind of a new idea to a lot of people who didn't have the same sort of education that we were, lucky enough to have. And so this was an example of how some of our legends can help us, I guess, where traditional knowledge really does inform what science may not know yet. And what science can also find out, but it might take some time. And in environmental restoration, in environmental work, in a lot of this, I guess, more scientific work, we're under a shortened time frame, particularly because of climate change. So climate change is changing our homelands in the world and our ecosystems across the world faster than science could have ever predicted. So in some ways, science is under a shortened time frame and they need to figure things out. And so these are ways where traditional knowledge can help inform the science, and it can be a little bit more reciprocal. Here's an example or a definition of what a legend is from the encyclopedia. Legends resemble folk tales in content. They may include supernatural beings, elements of mythology, or explanations of natural phenomena, but they are associated with a particular locality or person and are told as a matter of history. So we refer to these as our legends because they really are our history. They do help explain our history. They usually have a moral attached to them. But this helps us know about, what happened in our homelands and in our environments in the past. So I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit now and talk about traditional knowledge and some of, I guess, some environmental conditions that we are both kind of, in some ways, trying to address, but then also these were never problems that our ancestors had because our ancestors were always an integral part of our environment. But so I'm going to talk about these as if they're problems. They're not really problems. They just need Washoe people within the landscape to restore them to healthier conditions. And so in willow management, we always used willows for our baskets. And Washoe basket weavers are kind of world famous. The early Washoe basket makers were world famous for a lot of our different designs and the uses. But with willows, they're a really good source of wood. But if you want to use them for baskets, you have to tend to them. And so if you just let willows grow, and I'll give you an example. If you just let them grow, they get really woody, they get really weedy. They start sucking up more water than they need. And they kind of become much more of a nuisance. These willows, you can't really use for anything. You can't really use them for baskets because they haven't been tended to. But with careful management, and traditionally they could have been burned or they could have just been, I guess, harvested, and that would keep them long and straight and perfect for making baskets. If you just let them grow out, when our people aren't making baskets, when they aren't collecting willows, the willow becomes really weedy and it makes it so much harder to, they're impossible, they're really impossible to use for baskets. And so traditionally, Washoe women would kind of have the same sites that they would always go back to for gathering willow. And everybody would make baskets, or every woman used to know how to make baskets because it was something that you'd have to do kind of constantly. They were used in all aspects of their lives, in cooking and preparing food, storing things, storing water, for holding our babies. And so it was something that was a super important and integral part of our landscape that isn't happening anymore. And to get it to happen again at the level that we need it to, really will involve restoring both our traditional practices, teaching women, revitalizing those teachings of making baskets, but then also those land uses. So in environmental science, we might not always be able to get everyone back on the landscape using it how our ancestors were, but we can try to replicate some of those practices. And so I do share, a story sometimes, because these are really woody and they use a lot of water, and in areas where there isn't a lot of water and where there's streams, kind of clearing these out provides more water, where we get better willows, and then water for other plants that are equally as important, but may not have been used at such a high level as the willows were. Another aspect of traditional knowledge that is kind of important for both science and both kind of our environment, but it's also, sustenance practices, subsistence practices. And Washoe people traditionally were fishermen. This was something that was happening in a very large way. And then they were also trading with the outside communities. So these yellow arrows are trade routes, basically, of where fish would either be traded out or traded back in. The arrows, I don't think the arrows are that important. I think that it was kind of, both ways, and so I bring this up for a couple of reasons. Is that one, Tahoe, because of sports fishing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, really was depleted at such a high degree that a lot of the native fish did end up becoming more extinct and a lot harder to get. They don't get nearly as big as they used to. For being such a large lake, they definitely don't get as big as they used to. And now they really do require careful, fishery programs where you introduce fish and that you kind of protect the spawning areas, so that they introduce native fish and protect the spawning areas so that they are able to reproduce and thrive. But there's a lot of non-native fish that are taking up resources and taking up food and out-competing our native fish. And so they've also become a nuisance. So one thing that kind of Washoe families just started doing these last, maybe it's been about, I don't want to say it's been 10 years, but maybe about 6 or 7 years. But our tribe has worked with the Forest Service to allow for a cultural fishing day, where our families and tribal members can go out and get the kokanee salmon, which are non-native to our lands. These were a fish that were introduced, but they can go out and collect those as kind of a way to help with the overpopulation issue, but then also to revitalize our traditional fishing practices. And so one of the rules, that we've kind of agreed upon was that we'd use traditional mechanisms. And so on the picture on the left is my cousin, and he's using a spear that either he made or one of our family members made, and he's out there trying to spear one of the kokanee. And so this is an event now that everybody looks forward to every year. They just had it this last Saturday. I didn't get to go, but it's a really great event, and it's a way that we've been able to revitalize some of our traditional practices, as well as do something that's important for our homelands. But then I kind of pose this question as well, as how do you know how many fish you can take without making them go extinct? And this is another way where we've traditionally our people used to know, right? It was something that was innate, it was something that was inherent. But now we're at a point where we aren't using the landscape. We're not fishing as much as we used to, or to the degree that we used to. And so we don't have like that same, the same sort of rules for ourselves. So it's also in a way where we do use science for our hunting season, for example, where we give out tags. And so if you don't get a tag, then you don't get a deer. And this is something that we have to do just because our resources are more finite now, and we don't quite have those traditional knowledge as far as when to stop and to make sure that continues to be sustainable. So that's another way where we're kind of relying on both ways, both our traditional ethics, but then also doing population analysis to know how many can be taken for the population, the fish or deer population, to stay sustainable. Another issue that we're currently working on is within our Pinyon-Juniper stands. And so this is on the eastern side of our homelands. And our pinyon trees, we call it dagum, are the seeds of those are edible, and they are a huge part of our culture, a huge part of our ceremonies, a huge part of our diet. And so they really were, in the fall time, our community members, our families would leave the Tahoe Basin because it was about to get winter there, and it was much more difficult to live there in the cold season. And they'd come out into the eastern area of our homelands, and they'd collect pine nuts. And they'd camp out for basically all of fall, and they'd gather pine nuts, and they'd cook them on the ground right there where they'd gather them. And they would store them so that they could have a stash for future years. And so everybody had enough pine nuts to get through a couple of years, because in our homelands, we have really cold winters and really hot summers, but we also have really moist years and really dry years. So we have a lot of variability. And so to be able to live within such extreme variable conditions, we had to know how to plan multiple years ahead. And so one of the things that one of the struggles that we're facing is that our pinyon and juniper trees have the scientific word is encroachment, but they've become overgrown within the same stands. So they're not as spread apart as they used to be. And because they've become overgrown, they've become even more prone to devastation from fires. And so when we have a wildfire come through, it kills all the trees, whereas before it would kill, there'd be a lightning strike, and that lightning strike would kill maybe the stand of 6 trees that were in that area, but throughout 2 other locations. The other part we're fighting against in this area is cheatgrass, an invasive species that carries fire. Even if the stands are less dense, that's still carrying it on the ground. And our trees themselves, they don't, as you can see in the picture on the right, they're really close to the ground. And so they weren't, I guess, a fire tolerant species even to begin with. And then on the inside of them, they don't prune themselves. So they don't drop their branches when their branches die. they hang on to them. And so they do require, I guess they require Washoe hands to be out there and collecting. They require us to be out there and cleaning out the dead branches, to clean out the understory so that the fire doesn't have a place to grow, to come in and to kill the trees. Our trees really need us to be out there collecting pine nuts and using them to the degree that our ancestors did if we really want to protect this resource for future generations. This year we had one of our most devastating fire seasons, and it with the largest fire impacting our homelands. And so at this moment we are working on revegetating 2 of the fires that happened 3 years ago. And so we're out there planting sagebrush with one of the crews that we've hired. But it's also something that revegetating after the fire to get a tree that produces seeds is going to take over 100 years. So what we're doing right now, we're trying to kind of lay that foundation for future generations, because I'm definitely not living to be 130, but maybe our next generations will be able to benefit from this. And so we're kind of thinking both now and into the future as well. And as I'm kind of closing this up, I just want to remind everyone that Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, is community knowledge. And so, one, we all lived in for our people, we lived in family camps. We didn't live in like a central community or, a central, some tribes or some nations have pueblos or longhouses where people had more kind of permanent communities. We were family bands and we were scattered kind of throughout. And so in a lot of ways, there's not going to be any single one family that knows everything, even if they never stopped using the land like they always did, because they only were a part of, where their family camp was and what their family knew. And so in order to revitalize this knowledge, we got to work with everybody. We have to listen to everybody. We have to talk to everybody. And then at the same time, we need to share it. Some things, there's going to be family stories that aren't appropriate to share. And that's kind of up to the different families if they choose to share that or not. But when it comes to revitalizing our practices, we want to, in my opinion, if we want to have this happen to the degree that our ecosystem can be restored again, we have to be willing to share it with others. And so this was a trip where we had a couple different families up in a meadow up in Tahoe. Mayala Wata is our word for it. And we were just out kind of looking at plants, but it turned out that the blueberries were in season, so we were gathering some blueberries. And the other part about this and sharing and revitalizing community knowledge is that it's an intergenerational activity. And so these are both moms with their daughters in both the pictures. And so if we really want this knowledge to continue to be passed on, it can't just happen, between a teacher and the kids, or it can't just happen between us and our peers. It has to be happening at these multi-generational levels where you have mothers and daughters and granddaughters, fathers, sons and grandsons, and everybody kind of in between, sharing that knowledge and being a part of these efforts. And moving forward, I'd kind of like to leave it on a little bit more of a positive note. We are trying to address these really significant environmental issues, but just to remind everyone that restoration and adaptation strategies are traditional, that resilience is inherent in our language, in our culture, and in our traditions. And then planning ahead for future generations really does require collective action. Not any one person can do it, and not any one family can do it. It does require, this collective activity where we're working together, not even in one location, but throughout our much more interconnected societies. So with that, I've got a couple of resources. I didn't include all my resources, but I should have, kind of ran out of time. But if people are interested in kind of learning a little bit more, these are some resources to start with. And with that, I am done.
Thank you for that, Helen. That was a beautiful presentation. At the moment, I don't see any questions in the chat box or any hands raised. People can ask questions now and I'll read them out loud, or there's a raise hand button underneath the participants panel, but until then, I'll ask you some questions I have. So something that's important to me is language, and I know before the start we had a very, very brief conversation on it. I wanted to know how learning your native language or how understanding Indigenous language relates to traditional ecological knowledge and what that journey has been for you.
Yeah. So for me, it's been a truly integral part of my work, I guess. And so when I was one of the lucky students, my dad, who's Washoe, he didn't grow up speaking Washoe because our family was, a lot of our elders believed that it would give their kids a disadvantage in the world if they spoke Washoe and they didn't speak good English. And so he didn't grow up learning Washoe, but it was always something to him that he considered one of like his greatest losses, and something that him and my mom kind of decided they didn't want for their kids. They wanted their kids to be able to speak Washoe. And so there was a big revitalization movement back in the 90s, and that's what started the language immersion school. And so we got to be a part of that. And so I would say that it's completely central to all of my work, because there's so many things that are in Washoe that we can't translate to English well. And we can do our best to translate it. We can try to translate the concepts, but that it's not something that could really be understood in English as well as it can be understood in Washoe. And when we think about our language too, like when it comes to restoring the environment and restoring our traditional practices, our language came from this land. So I think about like when I see the little chipmunks that are running around, our word for chipmunk is utsuli. And to me, that's just like is more appropriate of a word for chipmunk than chipmunk is. And so I really think that it's like there's just, without the language, you can only go so far, but when you have the language, you can take it even further. It also gives insight into what plants or animals might have been used for. And then also some of our plant names are like bear food, or like that's what they're translated as. And so it also kind of gives us a better understanding of what, like if, you know, we're trying to restore a certain wildlife population, might have a better understanding of what kind of foods that they liked, or what kind of areas they would have, like habitat they would have preferred. And so those are, yeah, I would say that it's definitely an integral part, and both in ethics, both in worldview, but even like very specifically in that you can only take it so far. You can take it pretty far, but you can take it so much further in the language than you can without it.
That makes perfect sense. With I guess one of the things I heard mentioned in your presentation is how there might be a bit of a misconception that, you know, nature in the US was pristine and no one touched it because there was hardly any natives, even though we know that's not true now. How do you think we can dispel like the misconception that, you know, nature is meant to be untouched versus it evolving with the people who lived here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years? And how do you bring that up in an academic setting?
Yeah, so it's hard. It's hard sometimes to have those questions or have those conversations, or to start those conversations with people who don't have a background in that. But I will say, so on one side of things, for my undergraduate degree, I was at the University of Washington, and it was a forestry program historically, and also had a better relationship with the tribes in the area. And so part of my undergraduate education was understanding that these fire resilient ecosystems are only fire resilient because Indigenous people were lighting fires to manage those areas and managing them for berries and things like that. So in some places there is that history and that knowledge in place. But then when I went to my master's degree to get my master's degree, a lot of work had been done in like the anthropology department as far as Indigenous knowledge in land use practices and plants. Like there was a lot of work done there, but not in the science disciplines. And so it was like, in some ways, starting brand new, having to bring up the literature, having to bring out the studies. But I always take it back a few steps to really simple concepts as far as like hunting. We know that if we don't, like, we know that humans are part of the ecosystem when it comes to hunting. We know if we don't kill deer, then they get a little too close to the river, and then they start overeating the plants. And so that, like, people do understand that humans were part of the hunting ecosystem, but you have to understand that it was also part of our meadows, it was part of our forests, it was part of, because we were using all of the land. The other part that I wish people would not, and this is the hard part too, because it's in policy now, it's in federal policy, but it's this idea of like a wild wilderness. It's an idea that wilderness created itself, and that it's always going to, like, what the wilderness needs is people to be separate from it. And what that's led to is these horrific forestry conditions, and particularly to like these devastating fires. And humans, I guess forests need humans, but they need Indigenous practices. They don't just need us to go in there, and then they need us to revitalize our Indigenous practices to make it sustainable.
Thank you. We have a few questions now, so the first one should be quick. Josh from Unity wants to know how the pine nuts taste there.
Yeah. Ours are way bigger. So in up here, and I just know this from personal experience, when we bring pine nuts down to the Southwest, my brothers went to school in New Mexico, and so they had a lot of Dene friends and friends from the Southwest. They're big pine nut eaters too. But when we brought pine nuts down there, everybody was like wide-eyed. They couldn't believe how big they were. Taste-wise, I'd say they're comparable, but size-wise, we got you guys.
I think we might overpick our pinions a little too fast and early down here.
Oh no.
We're quick. People are feeling out which forests are ready to be picked. So
yeah.
And right now it's east of Gallup that we heard that is the prime forest. And
oh man, that's
not gonna lie, we just went to New Mexico, Albuquerque, and we came back with about a couple pounds of pinions, and we blew through that before the weekend. So
yeah. Ours are scarce this year. We had a drought year, so they're pretty scarce, but they're still there.
A quick follow-up, do you guys use sugar pine nuts, or is it a different kind of tree?
It's a pinyon pine.
Okay.
And so there's like single leaf and double leaf pinyon pine, I think, are the two species, but it's pinyon pine.
Is it? Then I have another question from, from Anels. They want to know if the immersion program you're a part of is still running, and if so, how many youth are involved with the program there?
So it's not running like it was. It was an actual school, a language immersion school. So it was a full-time school. So all of us went there full-time as students, and that's no longer in existence. But we do have a language and culture department. And it's more like after school programs, and then a lot of like educational programming in the summertime. So kids still get access, but it's not full immersion and it's not an entire school. But I would say probably more youth are involved now. I would say that like when I was younger, it was still something like we were like the weird like language kids in some ways. Like it was something that like all the kids at the school took a lot of pride in, but like that it wasn't something that we were like sharing with our friends who didn't go to the school because we were a little embarrassed. But nowadays it's so much different where our youth really are like begging us and correcting us. Like if I don't wear a traditional Washoe skirt to one of our ceremonies or programs, there's going to be some girls calling me out that are like, where's your skirt at, Helen? And so there's definitely I would say more people involved and more people excited about our culture and our language and wanting to be a part of, you know, something similar, but there's a lot of red tape. So it's hard to get something like that going again. It was a little bit easier when they could say it was homeschooling, and now there's all kinds of different educational rules, but yeah.
Thank you. We have one more question I see here from David, who asks, do you think with the help of Indigenous knowledge and teachings, we can blend technology with traditional beliefs? Examples could be like archived with video, audio recordings, even as far as augmented reality and hologram storytelling and sacred site preservation to save it for years to come before all the elders with their knowledge have gone.
So I would say this is something that is a controversial topic because in short, like I think we are trying to find ways to use technology to share our teachings with our community members. And I would say kind of like because of COVID, it's made it so much harder. Like I miss my elders. I miss talking to my elders. I also don't want to put them in harm's way. But what are some ways that we can continue to share these teachings in a good way? Because that's the other hard part is like, there's certain things that we don't want recorded, that we don't want to be accidentally shared outside, or that we don't want, you know, to be accessed outside of even, you know, our family members, or accessed outside of certain situations or certain conditions. So I would say like, yes, there's definitely opportunities and benefits. Also with reaching younger folks, I think trying to find ways to like everybody's, I think it's like trying to find those better ways to get them access to it is important. And then I will also say that a lot of our elders weren't afraid of archiving. They weren't afraid of doing, I guess, recording our stories and recording our language. I know other cultures were very much against that. But a lot of our elders were recording stories, recording the language, recording songs, and those have been incredible resources to us today in trying to both revitalize and kind of the traditional practices, but also our understanding of, you know, some of the practices that we don't practice anymore. So, for example, it's been really hard for us, even though we know that our people used fire to manage the landscape. It's not something that a lot of our elders remember, like our elders today remember, and it's not something that they're like, they don't know how it happened. And so at this moment, we're trying to revitalize some of those practices, but we have to kind of look to all resources to figure out what that could have looked like. And then also another form of where we're also looking at contemporary fire practices and land use practices to revitalize that practice, because of climate change, we can't even if we knew, we couldn't do it like our elders did it. But to figure out, you know, how do we make our homelands stronger by revitalizing those practices?
So I think we have time for one more question. And I don't see any in the chat, so unless someone wants to post one real quickly, I have one more question for you. And it's around how, America, or rather, mainly white Americans, are kind of obsessed with the idea of rediscovering things. And especially when it comes to traditional ecological knowledge, where at Stanford, I've seen posters about how fire management is a new technique, which really irked me, being from also a California tribe. And I guess my question to you is, what's something that everyone here can take with them today, or a way that they can start having conversations to dispel this myth that, we weren't in like friendship with the land? How can we start dispelling that myth that, we, or start promoting rather, that we do have valuable knowledge to share, and that it should be in academia, and that we should have the authority to make those decisions for the land that we've been living on? Or just some tools you could share for people to take home.
Yeah, so I would say it's a complicated issue because you're going to run into multiple types of people. So you're going to run into the people who are going to be dismissive and say, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, none of that was happening here. It might have been happening somewhere else, but none of it was happening here. And then you're going to find people who are very like romanticize it, where they are like, tell us everything you can about this area. Let's get your elders here and do this because it's going to save the world. And like, in a lot of ways, that's also pretty dehumanizing because neither one of those acknowledge, I guess, the real work, which I feel like the real work and the harder work is doing our best to revitalize what that traditional knowledge is. And then in that way, once we start revitalizing it, then we can find those areas where we could find those areas where you could really push that boundary, right? So fire right now is a place where we can really push that boundary because it's finally become more understanding that that's a necessary part of our ecosystem. So it's an area where we know that this happened. We know it's important. Most people know that that's important. Let's start pushing those barriers because a lot of the like land management barriers are policy and jurisdiction and like legal issues where we can't go be Washoe on our own homelands because we got to go buy a permit from the resource, like the local forestry station. So it's like, I think figuring out, I guess my best advice is to really focus on revitalizing the knowledge because that's the area that we're not going to be able to get back. And then once you have something that you want to do, once you have something that like you can better understand, then to push that boundary right there because that'll open up more doors. But then I think like in general with talking to different kinds of people, kind of have to pick and choose like if it's your advisor and if you're getting your master's and it's your advisor, you got to be on the same page. And so sometimes it's worth it to kind of knock those doors down because you're opening doors for other people coming up behind you. But sometimes you got to kind of do your best to still, maintain that integrity, but jump through some of those hoops that you have to jump through to get your degree too. And then I think having a good network of other Indigenous scholars who are interested in the same things as you is the best thing ever, because they can send you to other resources. If your professor is asking for, show me the primary documentation. I get that from people from the Yale School of Forestry all the time. Send me that article. And it's like, it wasn't published but somebody's out there trying to publish that to make sure that it's open in both worlds. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have one more question? Do we have time for that or?
Sure. If Helen doesn't mind.
So
are you okay with that, Helen?
Yeah, that's fine.
Penny asked, at what age do you think you realized your language was important to you?
Yeah, so definitely, I would say that I knew when I was like, as long as I can remember, for as long as I can remember. When I was in Head Start, so my earliest memories are really like of my elders, but when I was in Head Start, we had one of our elders would come to the Head Start and volunteer and teach us, and she was my favorite teacher, and Adele James. And I used to just sit with her and I'd write books, and I'd ask her how to spell things and how to say things and use those. And then when we had the language immersion school, she was one of our teachers there. And then even now, she's one of our language teachers that I can still go to and talk to about the language. And so I would say that as far like 3 years old, when I started learning language, I knew it was important to me. And then, yeah, I would say I never, and then as I got older, I would say it just became even more important. So like the more I kind of learned about Western society or colonized society, it made it even more important. Like the language made it even more important, because there's a lot of things like, I mean, I know like colonization thinks that they have all the answers for us and like they're the civilized society and stuff, but there's a lot of problems with their society that we didn't have in our societies before colonization. And so I think like the more I learned in the Western framework, or learned more about American society and American culture, like having that foundation of Washoe culture and Washoe language was so much more important. Like I'm so much more grateful for that. And that's also like one of the reasons why, you know, I do my best to give back when people ask me how to say things, or if they ask me how to do things, I do my best to share it with them, because I'm so grateful that I had that foundation, and so grateful that our elders were like so willing to share when I was a kid. Because I think a lot of people don't have those same privileges.
Well, I think Josh is going to wrap it up now, but thank you so much for being here and speaking today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We're definitely elders in training, I guess, at this point. We're not old yet, but
Get there.
we're getting there. But yeah, thank you. And I really like the idea, and I think we're pretty similar in age. We won't say how old, but it's kind of nice to learn a lot of these things, especially I guess in a way that we always look towards our elders for like some traditional knowledge, but now we're starting to see it, you know, in our friends or colleagues, and I think that's really cool. And that's kind of why I like being a part of the organization that I work with, is that a lot of my friends are now doing some great things in their community, and we're getting to that point. And I think a lot of young Native youth, even those that are in college, are still learning. You know, they're still Padawan learners. You know, and we're Jedi Knights, but we're not masters yet. You know, we're not Yoda. And little Star Wars reference for anybody that's excited for Mandalorian this coming weekend. But yeah, I really enjoyed this presentation. And for a lot of people that are still watching, I can tell that they're intrigued because nobody dropped off. That's one thing I always like watching the numbers fluctuate. But as we wrap up, I do have, my name is Joshua, so I didn't quite introduce myself. I work here with Unity as a project coordinator here on staff, for those that are not familiar with myself. But I wanted to mention that we will have a follow-up email. There'll be a couple of items on there. One, if it's cool with Helen, we can post this recording to our YouTube channel, which we're posting all our fall webinar series. So this is one of our youth tracks, and I thought this would have been a great topic, especially for youth. And if you're familiar with Unity, we have an Earth Ambassadors program, which I did see a couple of Earth Ambassador students who are in that program with us. on the list that was watching. But we also have an adult track on Thursday. So for the adults that are on, those topic of discussions are a little bit different. And how those discussions are handled are definitely different, especially those that work with Native youth. So that takes place on Thursday. I will share upcoming webinars in the email as well as an evaluation link. And it's pretty much some generic questions, asking how the presenters did and, future topics and everything that could be of interest. But so I'll try to get some more resources. We did have one person, Shoshana, asked if there could be a list of resources that could be shared from this presentation. If Helen is cool with that. I know she's really busy. Maybe she'd be able to share some info with me, and then I can disperse it out to those that register for the Zoom link. And there are plenty of people who have registered that did not attend, and I think sometimes they want to check it out. So that's what the YouTube video is. And in case nobody is familiar with our YouTube channel, we actually, I think, we're about to crack 200 videos on our YouTube channel, anything from our conferences to just fun videos, youth messages and stuff like that. We're definitely trying to advertise our YouTube channel more than our Instagram and Facebook, especially now that we're seeing our demographics change. We see a lot more youth on Instagram and not Facebook, and where everybody's at. So, but YouTube seems to be our growing resource as an organization. So, but I want to thank everybody that jumped on. Any last questions for Brooke or Helen? Otherwise, we can go ahead and wrap up. I know everybody's kind of got a busy day. You would think that we would be less busy working at home, but actually it seems like we're more busy now. But I want to also thank Brooke. She did a good job. Yeah. I don't see any more questions. Just Penny said, thank you, wonderful presentation. But yeah, all right. Well, thank you. We'll go ahead and wrap up. And I want to thank Helen again. She actually did a wonderful presentation today. I enjoyed it. I was watching the whole thing. So, and thank you, Brooke. So I will go ahead and end it. And yeah, it's tough to end presentations. So, all right, everybody have a good day. And I will email everybody.